Hi, and welcome to Module 4. This is the module in which you'll assess your likely resources and figure out how to implement your plan, regardless of a possible shortfall in your available funding. A note, in this module you'll explore your funding situation and funding-related issues, even though the fundraising module, which is Module 5, is still forthcoming. Bear in mind that these processes are not linear, but iterative, just like the steps of the conservation standards. Even though we present them in this order, ultimately you'll apply them according to the specific needs and timing of your project. Think of Module 4 as the diagnostic or reality check module, where you examine what actual funding and resources you have and how they'll realistically support the plan and the budget you've created. When we plan conservation projects, there's a tendency to be ambitious. Often, the reality is that you won't have sufficient funding to carry out all your plans. So Module 4 presents a crucial step in that you'll review your conservation standards planning outputs and consider whether and how to adjust them to fit the reality of your funding situation. Specifically in this module, you'll compare your project budget with your anticipated funding. You'll learn how to adjust and reprioritize your conservation actions in light of your expected financing. And you'll consider the potential consequences of those adjustments and how they may play out in your implementation phase. It's time to make some tough decisions. Let's look at the learning objectives. By the end of this module, you'll be able to demonstrate the following skills. 1. To select and apply a set of prioritization options for reviewing your project strategies and to align them with your likely funding. You'll also be able to describe under which circumstances to use each. 2. To review your conservation standards project planning outputs and adjust them to fit the reality of your funding situation. 3. To define a first and second pass review and when to use each. 4. Describe step-by-step how to consider and adjust for the consequences of your budget pruning decisions. Let's remind ourselves of where we are in the conservation standards cycle. We are here in Step 3. And specifically, we're getting busy to implement our plan. In previous modules, you've developed and refined your work plan and budget. Now it's time to figure out how to implement your project with your available funding. After all your work in Module 2 and 3, you now have a high-level work plan and budget. And like I said, what you currently have is most likely too ambitious. Now is the time to focus and prioritize so you come away with the best possible suite of actions given your overall context and your likely staff and funding resources. For example, if you have only 60% of the funding your plan requires, you need to make some tough choices. There is no one right answer here. The process is about making decisions with your team, thinking through the implications, and importantly, documenting the rationale for your decisions. Once you've gone through the prioritization exercises described in this module, it'll be very important to take an honest look at your final suite of strategies and to ask whether it makes sense to move forward with the project. The team needs to ask itself, can we still have the impact we need to have? So let's say you have your project all worked out, complete with your strategies and activities. You've worked hard on it and you believe it's a strong and effective plan. In a way, it's like nurturing a tree to life. But, and this is often the big elephant in the room, your likely funding may just not be enough to complete your project as envisioned. Maybe it turns out that a funder you counted on won't be able to help you. Or you get word that a part of your funding has been eliminated. So initially this could loom huge, a kind of elephant-sized problem. But take heart, because many conservation teams find themselves in this situation at some point. This is not the time to panic. It's time to get creative. The question is, what do you do? Well, you start pruning. Okay, maybe that's a bit too much. We'd recommend you approach this with more of a scalpel than a hatchet, or rather, scissor hands. So, for a tree to stay healthy, it might need some trimming. Maybe there's a drought, and in order to keep your tree viable, you must prune away some less essential parts. In the same way, when you have a funding drought, it may be better to pare down parts of your plan. That way you can ensure the overall viability of the plan, even if it means sacrificing part of it in the short or even long term. So let's look at how to do this. And we start again with a full tree. Just as with pruning a tree, there's an art to trimming a conservation plan to suit your funding realities. So here's one way to do it, and note that you can adapt this method as needed to the various situations you may be facing. The first thing is to go back to your overall strategy and its interventions and look for obvious ones to eliminate, postpone, or scale back. We call this a first pass. So this first pass is really a very quick high-level review, where you eliminate, postpone, or scale back those strategies you already know can be trimmed. If it's not that obvious to you, you could look for strategies that are lower rated or that are kind of unusual or different from the rest in that they could significantly detract from other strategies or that they don't align well with your team's skill set. You can also look for strategies that influence less critical factors, or for strategies that you can get someone else to implement. Looking at your marine example, here are the 4 main strategies. Rat elimination, there is the strengthen law enforcement strategy, the sustainable ocean fisheries strategy, and the campaign to stop shark fin soup. So the campaign to stop shark fin soup down here on the right was a lower rated strategy, even though by just a bit. And you realize that running a campaign at the level needed to influence shark fin consumption will require a lot of resources. So you decide to trim back parts of this strategy. You're also aware that the strengthen law enforcement strategy at the top, while important, is somewhat outside your team's skill set. And you recognize its success depends on having a stable government in place, which is a problem because there's presently some instability in the country. In other words, the enabling conditions are not in place. So you decide to postpone this strategy until after elections, when hopefully the situation will be more constant. Just like with some plants, you can lob off this strategy and store its cutting on the side, where hopefully it will sprout in future. Here, you could also consider partnering. Funding is important to fuel your budget, but there are other ways to carry out certain strategies, even if your funding is short. For example, you can look to others who have specific skills and partner with them, or engage their expertise in some way. For example, you've just decided that the campaign to stop shark fin soup could be expensive to implement effectively. But you then discover there's an organization with a lot of experience running similar campaigns. So you contact them to see if you could be partners with them, which will conveniently reduce your budget by quite a bit. Okay, so you've now taken a first pass through your strategies, and you're left with, say, these parts of the plan. But your likely funding still falls short of your proposed budget. So what do you do now? At this point, you do a second pass, and that is where you look at your interventions in a more systematic way, to see if there are any parts that you could, again, eliminate, postpone, or scale back. As we said before, you're on the lookout for interventions that are lower rated, that are unalike, i.e. may not complement or support your other strategies, that influence less critical factors, or that you could pass off to someone else. So examining the suite of strategies in the marine example, you see that both the rat elimination and the developed sustainable ocean fishery strategies address somewhat less critical factors. But looking at your conservation targets, you realize the rat elimination strategy is time sensitive because increasing rat populations could decimate the population of seabirds whose eggs they eat. Clearly, this is a strategy you can't afford to postpone. So you decide to rather scale back your sustainable ocean fishery strategy. In the next round of decision making, you'll see how to limit this decision's effect on the overall project. Okay, so you've scaled back your sustainable ocean fishery strategy and you still need to trim your budget a bit more. So maybe you explore if there are any strategies that you can get someone else to implement. Are there organizations already working on combating invading rats, for example? Maybe you find one that can take care of the problem for much cheaper than you can. So you pass this strategy off. There's also another option to consider. You could scale back your geographic or your thematic scope and focus your plan more on a regional or local scope. But let's say you really don't want to do this. You believe that every single strategy is necessary for your plan to be effective, and yet you have this persistent funding problem. What do you do? Here, you can look at whether there are alternative ways to implement your project, such as doing significant fundraising. Can you secure more funding or in-kind donations? Yeah, they say money doesn't grow on trees, but boy, do we wish it did sometimes. Or you could also carefully review your budget and consider where you could trim back or eliminate some expenses. Staffing is often one of your most expensive budget items. Can you reduce staff time by getting help from less expensive staff? For instance, you may be able to use university students to help you research the effectiveness of rat barriers. While your staff have these skills, you realize you could provide student stipends for significantly less. This way, you could free up your more expensive staff for activities that require specialized skills. At other times, it may be cheaper to hire a professional consultant, especially if they have a lot of experience and can do the job more quickly and efficiently. For instance, the rat attack team you partnered with has decades of experience eradicating rats. Keep in mind that your staff and their years of experience are an incredible asset, so it's important to figure out how you can put them to best use. So there are also other expenses that might be trimmed. For example, can you rent vehicles rather than buying them? Could you hold virtual webinars rather than in-person workshops? But be sure not to eliminate truly necessary expenses here. So let's say you've gone through all the steps of looking at what can be eliminated, scaled back, and postponed, and you've ended up with something like this. Some strategies are eliminated, some are scaled back, some have been transferred or have become part of a partnership. Now it's time to consider the consequences of those decisions, the final reality check. Here are some questions you can ask. With what we have now, can we still be successful? Can the individual strategies still be successful? Are there interventions that are dependent on any of those we've already trimmed, and how will they be affected? How will this affect our stakeholders? Are there any parts of the plan that are not that urgent and can wait till later? Let's take a look at this in terms of our conservation standards planning process. To examine the consequences of your decisions, you can go to your situation model where you can see all your strategies and interventions at a glance, and you can easily examine the relationships between the various factors. This can help you determine the impacts of certain decisions on all possible factors. For example, you've decided to scale back the Develop Sustainable Ocean Fishery strategy. The critical factor this strategy is addressing is unsustainable fishing by locals. But you can see here that if you scale it back too much or for too long, it could lead to an increase in physical damage to the reef structure. That would ultimately impact two of your conservation targets, the seagrass beds and the coral reefs. So let's return to our decision-making tree. Like we've said, this is a time for tough decisions. And that means that finally, you also have to consider the option of abandoning your project. This is not something to consider lightly, but it is a question you have to ask once you've gone through the above steps. Here, you take a step back, look at what you have left of your strategy's post-reality check, and ask, can we still be effective? Would this plan still be a good use of conservation resources? If not, you may have to make the very difficult decision to abandon your efforts. And yep, the mere idea of it can make your stomach turn. But let's say you've not abandoned your project. You've settled on a good plan, even if it's at a somewhat smaller scale, or even if it's quite different from what you'd originally envisioned. You may end up with different partners or different priorities. Most importantly, your plan now matches the reality of your funding situation. In many cases, practitioners find that this exercise actually strengthens and focuses their plans in ways they could not have imagined at the start. Finally, you'll then update your work plan and budget to reflect the decisions you've made, checking that you've assigned realistic workloads to all your staff and contractors. In many ways, the process of balancing your budget with your available funding is like navigating a maze. You have to keep trying different routes until you find the one that will lead to success. So that brings us to the end of Module 4. Congratulations, you got through a tough decision-making process. We hope you feel more confident to thoroughly review your project, give it an honest reality check, and adjust as needed. In Module 5, we'll look at fundraising options and how to use your conservation standards products to convince a donor to fund you. That'll come in handy if, in your Module 4 reality check, you decided to apply for new funds. So, now on to planning for and structuring your funding proposal. That comes up next in Module 5. Thanks, everyone.